Thank you. It's great to be with you this evening, and I'm going to dive straight into the material I've got because I don't want us to waste time too much. So this subject of abundant life, the best kind of, the fullest kind of life. I take that phrase from some words of Jesus in John chapter 10, verse 10 in the New Testament, where Jesus says, "I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly," or have it to the fullness. But I also want to use that phrase, abundant life, because it, in a sense, sums up something that is universal in human experience. In all cultures and people from all faiths and none want to have a good life, a full life, a successful life, however we define that. As Pat mentioned, I work for A Rocha. It's actually two words, and they are in Portuguese originally because that's where the organization started off. It means the rock, A Rocha, or A Rocha in Portuguese. And we're an international Christian conservation organization inspired by God's love, now working in more than 20 countries around the world, doing practical conservation projects on biodiversity conservation, working with local communities. And as Pat's already mentioned, my role is particularly at the thinking end, the theological end of that, thinking and writing on this whole area. So what is abundant life? Both in Western and in Eastern and in Chinese philosophy, people's definition of success and of abundant life tends to include some of these things: success and wealth, longevity, long life, health, prosperity. Those are fairly universal aspirations around the world, historically and very much today in the 21st century. Sometimes people talk about abundant life in terms of the American way of life. That's a particular variation on it, a particular variation on the theme. With the promise of the world's highest standard of living, although this was from the 1950s, as you can see. And we'll come back to that particular variation on the theme of the abundant life. But there are fairly universal ideas behind this concept of abundant life. The idea of good health, of adequate wealth, of plenty of possessions, of security from threats that may face us. And particularly, I think, in the 21st century, freedom and mobility have been added to that list of requisites for abundant life. People want autonomy, the freedom to choose their own direction, the freedom to move, to travel the world, to go to the places that they want to go to. And that's fairly universal in people's idea of abundant life. But there is a problem, and I'm going to outline that problem in some depth before I go on to looking at possible solutions. The problem is, of course, that definition of abundant life puts a huge pressure on the planet and its resources. Back in the 1950s, when America was recovering from the economic costs of the Second World War and its involvement there, there was a huge emphasis on consumerism as a way of life. And I find this a very revealing quotation from the 1950s. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life. Notice the semi-religious language here, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, and discarded at an ever-increasing rate. Now, that was said in the 1950s, but in many ways that has been the history of globalization, the history of the world in many ways over the last 50 or 60 years, seeing things consumed at an ever-increasing rate. And I want to suggest that increasing consumption has put a real pressure on what are often talked about as the three pillars of sustainability: the social, the environmental or ecological, and the economic. These three pillars support the idea of sustainable development, but the foundations of each of the three pillars are being shaken by the enormous growth in global population and in global consumption. that earlier picture I put up of the world's highest standard of living, the American way of life, is rather overshadowed sometimes when we see the flip side of that, when we see the human cost of that way of life, and the fact that often it's very unevenly shared. Some have and others often do not have. And of course, in the last 10 years or so, we have seen huge upheavals in our global economic system. A system based on borrowing and debt. I find this a very interesting comparison between the economic and the ecological shaking. Just as our banking centre is struggling with its debt, so nature's life support systems are failing to cope with the debts we have built up there too. If we don't face up to this, then nature, the biggest bank of all, could go bust, and no amount of quantitative easing will revive it. I don't know, I deliberately didn't put up who said that. You probably might not guess, but it was actually Prince Charles, somebody who has thought quite deeply about both the ecological and the economic issues here, spoken just after the big crash of 2008. One of the other factors that we need to put in here when we're thinking about abundant life, we're thinking about the good life, is what do we actually need? There is this idea that more makes us happy, but the evidence does not actually follow that up. Studies in Princeton and repeated across many parts of North America, Europe, and many parts of the developed world show that as standard of living increases, happiness does not always increase. It seems that we need our standard of living to be above a basic level, where our need for food, shelter, security, health, once those basics are met, then the more we have above that does not necessarily make us any happier. And in fact, in many cases, it makes us unhappier. So more does not necessarily make us happier. And I don't know if you recognize this virus here. Those aren't Hong Kong dollars on the end, those are actually UK pounds. I want to suggest that this virus is more dangerous than SARS, more dangerous than bird flu, and this is the affluenza virus, a painful, contagious social condition of overload, debt, anxiety, and waste from the dogged pursuit of more. And social scientists are increasingly talking about affluenza as a dangerous condition that is causing psychological mental health problems across huge swathes of the developed world. And to move from sociologist to a pop singer, don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Lily Allen, but one of her best songs, I think, was one called The Fear, where she talks about the angst that is caused by being part of a consumer society. I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault, it's how I'm programmed to function. I don't know what's right and what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it will all become clear? Because I'm being taken over by the fear. Now, if she was a philosopher rather than a pop singer, she would have written, I'm being taken over by the existential angst. But that doesn't kind of go in a pop song very well. So the fear, that deep sense of anxiety. Am I doing well enough? Am I keeping up with my neighbor? What is my life doing to the planet? Can I change it? Or am I just simply a cog in a machine of consumerism? And then, of course, ecological chaos. So the shaking of the economic, of the social, and of the ecological pillars. And I want to go in a little bit more detail here. Some of this may be familiar to some of you, but I'm conscious that we have a very varied audience this evening. What we see is that over the last century, and even more over the last 50 years, the human impact on the planet has been exponentially growing. And that's partly, of course, because human population has been growing so exponentially. Within my lifetime, the world's population has more than doubled. And we can see from less than 1 billion in 1750, now towards 7 billion and counting. But as that graph goes up, so a whole number of others do as well. So we can look at our carbon dioxide emissions globally, going up to and now beyond 400 parts per million. We can look, and you don't need to look at the detail of these, it's just the general impression of all these graphs together. We can look at fertilizer consumption, which actually is related to carbon dioxide emissions because most fertilizers are based on oil. But we can see that that has grown absolutely hugely since 1950. We can look at fresh water use. Many people are saying that the wars of the 21st century will be fought over water rather than over oil. One of the countries that I know best is India. And India, with its huge neighbors, China and Pakistan and Bangladesh, are already having disputes over access to water. Who does the water belong to? Does it belong to the countries where the source of the water is, or all the countries that that water flows through? These are huge subjects of debate in our 21st century world. We can look at tropical forest loss increasing hugely over the last 50 years. We can look at marine fish capture. The figures only go back to about 1950. And you'll notice how rapidly that has grown, but it's already declining, simply because stocks of fish globally are declining so rapidly in many places that there's no way that the graph can keep going upwards. It's already beginning to decline. We can look at transportation, again, just since about 1965, and you can see how rapidly that graph has grown. And we could really carry on looking at graphs like that the whole evening, but I just want to give that impression of the exponential growth in our human impact. And the consequences of that are felt all over the world. According to the WWF's latest State of the Planet report, there's been a 52% decline in wildlife populations since 1970. In fact, that was the 2014 one. I think in the 2016 one, it was a 58%. It's already gone up. Now, that does not mean 52% or 58% of species have gone extinct. It's talking about overall populations. Some of the commonest species are the ones that have declined the most. But we can see that particular amphibians and reptiles have gone down a huge amount, 76%. If we look at deforestation, sometimes pictures like this illustrate it most forcefully. This is a map of a coastal province in Brazil, South Bahia, as it was in 1945, almost completely covered in primary forest. So that's 1945. Here's the same map by 1990. So 1945, 1990. And of course, that could be replicated not just across huge areas of South America, but also huge areas of Africa and of many other parts of the world as well. And then climate change. We don't know fully what the impacts are going to be. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, makes projections, weighing up all the evidence it can within margins of error, looking at different scenarios depending on how much the temperature rises. If it rises by as much as 3 degrees, and if we don't fully implement the Paris Agreement, it will do that. And of course, all the news today is about whether or not Trump is going to pull out of the Paris Agreement tomorrow. But a 3-degree rise will lead to all those red areas on the map, a decline of 50% or more in crop yields. So how are we going to feed the world's population if we have that increase in temperatures? Flood risk is a huge consequence of climate change. This is the 10 highest cities globally and their annual flood costs by 2050. Guangzhou in China, $13 billion a year, the cost if we carry on as we are with climate change. Shenzhen, just next to Hong Kong, $3.1 billion a year, the cost of mitigating flood risk by 2050. And we can carry on in other parts of the world as well. These are global issues that affect us all. And now more than half the world's population live on the coast. More than half the world's population live in cities. So coastal cities are where most people live, and this is where the cost is going to be. And then we can look at resource depletion, particularly in terms of fossil fuels. And there's a lot of secrecy within the oil and gas and coal industry about reserves and how long they're going to last. This is particularly looking at oil and gas, and we may have already peaked in terms of peak oil and where we're going. And that's why, of course, controversial areas like shale gas production, fracking, and so on are happening in debates about those are happening in parts of the world, as the conventional and easy to get forms of fossil fuels are disappearing. So whether or not we think we need to move rapidly away from fossil fuels because of climate change, we are going to have to, because they are going to run out and become more and more expensive compared to other forms of energy production. Population I looked at very briefly earlier, but if we project into the future, we don't know for sure how big the world's population is going to grow. The UN tends to think that it will tail off and stabilize somewhere between 9, 10, 11, maybe as much as 12 billion people. But of course, that has been growing hugely within our lifetimes. And all of this together becomes what we talk about when we talk about our global footprint as human beings. A global footprint is a useful measure both at the global level but also at the per capita level, as we think of us as individuals and our impact on the planet in terms of our impact on carbon, on cropland, on fishing, and so on and so on. Now that's a map of the world that you may not have seen before. It's a distorted map of the world because it's looking at the ecological footprint of some of the major nations of the world. And so you see that some countries have shrunk. Much of Africa, much of South America look much smaller than they physically are because their carbon footprint is generally, and their ecological footprint is much smaller. But other parts of the world have a much larger ecological footprint, both because of the per capita footprint and also because of the size of population. So the more populated areas, as well as the areas that have a big per capita consumption, are all looking very large on that. Britain looks very odd, I have to say. And since 1970, as a planet, we have been exceeding our global footprint. In other words, our biocapacity, which is the capacity of the Earth to support its population, that is the green line that goes down here. And that's been going down because the population's been going up. We've got a fixed amount of world, and even if we use it more efficiently, the population has been meaning that our biocapacity has been going down and our ecological footprint has been going up. So since about 1970, we have been exceeding the world's biological capacity. Something has to change. Either our population has to shrink or our footprint has to shrink in the long term. We cannot carry on like this. And this is very specifically looking at China's footprint. And of course, China's population grew enormously, but then stabilized because of the one-child policy. But the ecological deficit has grown because China has become more prosperous. And that has brought many, many advantages. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's brought education and health to hundreds of millions of people. But there has been an ecological cost to that at the same time. China's average ecological footprint in 2013 was 3.6 hectares per person, but its national biocapacity was less than 1 hectare per person because it has such a large population. And this, just out of interest, I've put this one up. It's a very interesting look at where China's consumption is highest. And we can see that manufacturing, because the economy is so heavily based on manufacturing, that is an enormous proportion of China's consumption. In many other parts of the world, you'll find that the residential is actually the biggest part, but not in China. And of course, that's because much of that manufacturing is, of course, then being exported to other parts of the world. And here again is the global graph, world biocapacity going across the middle there, but our increase in consumption, and particularly that purple one there, is carbon. That's the one that's grown most rapidly. Croplands as well. But it's very uneven. And for those who have an ethical basis, whether that's religious or not, the injustice, the inequity of levels of consumption globally is enormously disproportionate. And we can look at that in this way. We can also look at that in this way. The size of each circle, the size of the pie charts, is the average per capita consumption. So if you look at the United States there, the consumption, and I can just actually put on the key here. So what Americans spend simply on mobility would be greater than the total footprint of middle-income countries such as China or Argentina alone. And look at less developed countries like Tanzania, where nearly 3/4 of their footprint is on food. Hardly anything gets in there at all. We live in a world today where the world's richest 20% consume 16 times as much of the world's resources per person per year as the world's poorest 20%. Now that figure is, I think, really important because population growth is sometimes talked about as if that is the biggest problem. And population growth is important, but consumption growth is an even bigger issue. Because it takes 16 babies born in a wealthy country, born in a poor country, to consume what one baby born in a wealthy country will consume. And when you look at average life expectancies, a baby born, for instance, in Western Europe will consume about 30 times as much resources in its lifetime as a baby born in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. So there are massive issues of justice here in terms of global consumption. And then we come to the planetary boundaries. And that's a concept that has been really growing over the last 8 or 10 years. It was first coined by a group of Stockholm-based scientists, Rockström and others. And the idea is that if we are to have sustainable human life on this planet, then we need to respect that the planet has certain boundaries that we must not transgress. And those are in a whole lot of different areas, and I'm not going to go into the complexity of this. But biosphere integrity, climate change, ozone depletion, ocean acidification. Some of these areas, the science is still vague. There are still question marks. But basically speaking, we need to stay within the green zone. Where we get into the yellow zone, that is increasing uncertainty and risk. When we get into the red zone, we know we are causing permanent damage to the world's ecosystems, to, if you like, our own life support system. What supports the further existence of humanity on this planet. This is a fascinating graph, which we could spend the whole evening looking at on its own. This compares ecological footprint per person up the right-hand side. So the ones that are highest up, some of the Gulf states like Qatar, Australia, which is hugely dependent on coal, the United States, those have the biggest ecological footprint. China is fairly middling in ecological footprint. And across the bottom here are the happiness scores. As social scientists now have fairly sophisticated ways of asking people about how satisfied they are, about how abundant they feel their life is. And you can see that China is actually fairly much in the middle on both lines there. You can see that if you are in a very poor country, if you are in Syria with war, if you're in Burundi, again with war, and many other very poor countries, then your happiness levels are low because you fear for your life. You don't know if the harvests are going to produce your food. You don't know if your children are going to survive until their first birthday. And those are going to affect your levels of happiness quite highly. But once we get to this end of the graph, it becomes far more complicated. And some of the wealthier countries are not necessarily the happier countries. It does seem very clear that the more you have, you do not necessarily get much richer. And some of the relatively middle income or even poor countries, Costa Rica, which has a ecological footprint lower than China, for instance, is one of the happiest countries in the world. Very interesting. We need to look at this graph a lot more. One of the figures that's come out quite interestingly is some of the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland are not only high income and quite high footprint, but they're also high taxation countries, which means that the gap between the richest and the poorer ones in those countries is smaller. And it seems that one of the factors in terms of whether people feel happy about their life is if the people living near to them have a good quality of life too. It's difficult to feel that you have an abundant life if your neighbor is obviously in distress. Now, putting all this together, there was a significant paper a few years ago by a couple of American thinkers, Schellenberger and Nordhaus, on the death of environmentalism. The fact that environmentalism has been going on as a popular movement since the 1960s, and yet things are getting worse globally. And they say over the last 15 years, environmental foundations and organizations have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into combating global warming, but we have strikingly little to show for it. And their solution, interestingly, as a group of secular writers on this, is to say environmentalists need to tap into the creative worlds of myth-making, even religion, not to better sell narrow and technical policy proposals, but rather to figure out who we are and who we need to be. And that brings us right back to that question of abundant life, who we are and who we need to be. Similarly, the UK, one of the biggest environmental thinkers in the UK, Jonathan Porritt, in a report he did with WWF and the UK's Sustainable Development Corporation, said there are few sources of authority, let alone wisdom, in addressing these environmental challenges that are not derived from religious or spiritual sources. And he's not a person of any particular faith himself. He's, I think, would describe himself as a seeker. We need to question what we mean by abundant life, and people have been doing that for a long time. This was Bobby Kennedy back in 1968, questioning what we measure by GDP, gross domestic product. We seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising. They contribute to the national product. And ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. These are all good news for gross national product. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. All of those things help gross national product. But do they help our quality of life? Do they bring us abundant life? The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Economic measures alone are not a satisfactory measure of abundant life. So we return to the question, what is abundant life? Is it simply success, wealth, long life, and health? Or is it more about things like joy? Oh, should be moving on. Peace? Well-being, contentment, relationships. If we think about what really matters in our lives, is it the size of the screens in our homes, the size of the cars that we have, or even our bank balance? Or is it actually some of these things here? Joy, peace, well-being, contentment, relationships. What I want to do in the rest of this lecture is look a little bit at some of the insights from biblical wisdom. And I've deliberately chosen some topics and chosen language here which I hope communicates whether or not you yourself would identify as somebody who believes the Bible or comes from a Christian background. Because I think there's a lot of common ground as we look at wisdom across traditions in this area. And so we're going to look at some of these values. Interdependence, we're all in this together. Relationship, that we are created to have an orientation towards others, not just towards ourselves. Localism, and I'll explain what I mean by that, rootedness and belonging. And holism, or integralism, seeing the big picture. And those values have virtues that come with them. The virtues of wonder, the capacity to receive life as a gift, of humility, of recognizing our own creatureliness, of restraint, of recognizing we need to put boundaries on our consumption. Enough is enough. And maybe the virtues of faith and hope and love, those three that St. Paul identifies in 1 Corinthians 13 as the core Christian virtues. So let me look at those one by one. And I'm going to kind of partner them. So interdependence and wonder I'm putting together here. Interdependence. We're all familiar. I actually took this from a school textbook, that picture there. We're all familiar with the idea that the earth is a bit like a spider's web where everything is connected and everything depends on everything else. It's the basic basis of the science of ecology. Ecology is actually a science of relationships, how things depend on each other. And the Bible actually has a lot to say about that. One of the longest passages of nature writing in any ancient literature is found in Psalm 104 in the Bible. It's a celebration of biodiversity, although that's a very modern term, not one you'll find in the Bible. It's a celebration of all sorts of creatures that exist, some of which are of benefit to human beings, who are listed alongside the other creatures in the psalm, but some of which are actually threats to human beings. So lions are celebrated, for instance, in that psalm. And all of them are seen as being good and valuable and contributing to a greater whole, to a world that is designed for the glory of God in a biblical standpoint. A world that has value in and of itself, not just because of what it does for us as human beings. And the psalm specifically identifies certain species, things like rock hyraxes or rock badgers, and it says the mountaintops belong to those. So the psalm is saying actually the whole world does not belong to human beings. In fact, elsewhere the psalms say very clearly the earth is the Lord's. It does not belong to human beings, Psalm 24. And what that psalm does is it invokes a deep sense of wonder at the beauty and the wildness, the fragility and the interdependence of wild nature. And there are other passages in the Bible that do the same. The end of the book of Job, chapters 38 to 42, does that in a wonderful way. I don't know if you're a fan of the wildlife documentaries of David Attenborough, the BBC documentaries, which are often wonderful. But when I read the end of the book of Job, I feel that like God is turning into a sort of divine David Attenborough, taking us on a tour of the wonders of creation in all its beauty and diversity. And that virtue of wonder is something I want us to pause on for a second. Because every young child has an innate sense of wonder. If you take a group of 2 or 3-year-olds into a park and just let them go, You don't need to entertain them. You don't need to inform them. They will just be lost in wonder. They will pick up insects and look at them. They'll look at spiders. They'll get down on their hands and knees and look at the flowers. They'll watch how the light comes through the leaves and makes patterns on the grass. There's that deep sense of wonder. And yet somehow in our contemporary world, and I think our education systems, and I speak as somebody with a teaching background here, our education systems have a lot to be responsible for this. We squeeze the wonder out of people as they grow up. We turn everything into knowledge. And we turn everything into a purpose, getting a qualification, getting a career, making somebody a useful cog in the industrial machine, rather than in seeing education as unlocking that sense of wonder and allowing people to grow into who they should be. And if we are to care for our planet successfully, if we are to reevaluate what we mean by abundant life, then I think we need to foster again a sense of wonder. Now, I live in a big city, similar size to Hong Kong, London. It's about 8 million people. I live in a very densely populated urban area. And for me, I find that as important as breathing is for me each week to spend time alone in nature, even in the big city. To just go for a walk along the canal, to spend a bit of time in the park, maybe just going for a jog, maybe going for a walk with my binoculars, maybe just sitting. And that might sound all a little bit kind of woolly, but it's about reawakening that sense of wonder. And I often find that the big worries I have about my work or my family or anything else, they come into perspective when that sense of wonder is reawakened. So that's the first thing, our sense of interdependence, that we are part of something far bigger than ourselves as human beings. We are part of an extraordinarily complex world where we all depend on each other, and we need that sense of wonder about that. And that sense of interdependence and of wonder actually fits back to this big discussion about sustainability and how the economic and the social and the environmental fit into each other. Because virtually all our politicians and all our political systems, here in Hong Kong just as much as in Europe, and we've got a general election in the UK next week, the environment is hardly on the list because it's a big long-term issue. It's not one politicians can make a difference to in the next 4 or 5 years. So they don't think they can get votes from it. What people get votes from is the economic. But the economic has almost become a monster. It has become an idol at times that consumes everything else. It's as if human beings only exist to serve the economy. And it's as if nature only exists to serve the economy. But actually that turns everything on its head. And this image here actually, I think, has things in perspective. We need to recognize that the whole purpose of the economic domain is to serve abundant life for human beings. If the economic domain is not making life better for people, then it is failing. Because that's what it's for. That's the only reason we have economics. And human beings need to recognize that we are 100% dependent on the ecological domain. Without it, there can be no human beings. Every breath we take, every bite of food we eat, every thread of clothing we wear comes from nature. We cannot exist outside nature. So the economic is a subset of the social, and the social is a subset of the ecological. And yet our political system reverses those constantly. And we need to recover a sense of perspective here. I put down here a Greek word, oikos. It's the Greek word for home. And it's the root word for ecology and for economy. They come from the same root word. They're about how we look after our home. What is our home for? This earth is our home. And the ecological and the economic need to fit within that. And then, secondly, relationship, an orientation towards others. There's been a huge debate in the environmental movement over the last 50 years between two broad worldviews. And you can find these images on Facebook and Google Images. They're the classic images of the two conflicting worldviews. On the left, the egocentric or the human-centered worldview that says the world is there for human beings, we can use it as we choose, it's there for us. And notice how often in that worldview you've got the male above and the female slightly below next to the blue whale. Why the blue whale, I don't know, but often those go together. It's this very hierarchical worldview. It's this idea that the world is just there for us. So we talk about human resources and natural resources. They're not just resources. Human resources are people. And natural resources are creatures and nature that has value of its own. So that's the egocentric. And some people think Christianity teaches the ecocentric because it teaches that human beings were made in the image of God. And therefore, some people think that means that we can have an egocentric view. But that's not what the image of God is about. The image of God is about reflecting God's character towards the rest of creation. And then we have the second worldview, the ecocentric, which basically says we live in a world of many species. What right have we as humans to put our values and our wants and our needs on top of those of all other creatures? All creatures have equal rights. We are just one randomly evolved species amongst the many. And many Christians kind of go, whoa, I can't go there, because that says that human beings aren't special in any way. And it's a very difficult worldview to live by. If you take it to its logical conclusion, of course you become vegetarian, probably vegan. And if you take it to its logical conclusion, you try and avoid any harm to any creature whatsoever. Like the Jain monks of India, who train themselves so when they turn over in their sleep, they whisk the bedsheet in case there's a bed bug or a fly that they might crush. But that ecocentric worldview is increasingly powerful within the environmental movement. And actually, if you look at Psalm 104, it's not very far away from that. It basically says we live in a world where there are all these amazing creatures. Humans are part of it, but we're only one part of it. So you could kind of take either from the Bible. But actually, a biblical worldview is a rather different one. It's this one, a theocentric worldview. That the world is fundamentally not for us, it's fundamentally for God. God so loved the world. And the Greek word in the New Testament is cosmos. God so loved the cosmos that he sent his only son. And human beings are special, not because we are the most important and we can treat the rest of the world like dirt. We are the most important because we are given a very special responsibility. We are given a task to tend and to keep the garden of God's good creation. We are, if you like to use an ecological term, the keystone species. The one that has the biggest power, the biggest impact, either for good or for evil, on the rest of creation. But if all of creation is valuable because it matters to God, then our role is not to dominate and destroy, it's to know our place in serving and preserving the rest of creation. Humility. The word comes from a Latin root, and it's the same word as soil, humus. Knowing that we are made from the dust of the earth. And that's what the name Adam means in the Bible. It means made from the dirt, made from the dust of the earth. Recognizing our humility, our place as the image of God to serve and preserve the rest of creation. And in our work in Arusha, that's very much what we try to do. So we try not to, going back, take sides and say it's either all about people or it's all about wildlife. We try and actually find ways of balancing those needs together. So 2 weeks ago I was in Kenya, where Arusha has a major project on the Kenyan coast, trying to protect an area of forest, the Arabuko-Sokoke forest, that is the biggest remnant of a forest that once stretched 3,000 miles down the East African coast, all the way from Somalia to South Africa. Now that forest is fragmented. And the Arabuko-Sokoke, it's about 60 kilometers by 40, is the biggest fragment left in the whole of Africa. There are certain species that are now found nowhere else that depend on that forest completely. And yet around the forest are quite poor communities, Christian and Muslim, who historically were chopping down trees and sometimes hunting bushmeat from endangered creatures within the forest. And Russia's policy was not to say we must put a big fence and armed guards around the forest and shoot anybody who dares to kill these rare creatures, nor was it to say people come first, even if it means rare creatures go extinct. Our policy was to say no. If this all matters to God, if we have a theocentric view, then we have to search for win-win solutions where people can have livelihoods that are sustainable, but also where we seek to protect and preserve God's creation. And so what that led to there was setting up a sustainable ecotourism scheme, because that part of the coast of Kenya has a lot of tourist hotels. But those tourist hotels weren't making money except for within their hotel grounds. People would go elsewhere in Kenya to have their safari and then have their beach holiday on the coast. And so what Arusha did was set up sustainable ecotourism into the forest, providing employment for the local communities and making the tourists pay generously for the privilege of visiting the forest, coming to an agreement with the hotels and tour companies that that part of the business, all of the money would be ring-fenced and put in a trust fund for the local community. And that trust fund now pays for the education of children from the villages all the way around the forest. Any family can apply, and we have seen children go all the way through their education, including through university, and then come back to serve locally as teachers. In fact, 2 people who've been through that system now work for Arusha. And it's proved a really good way. We were able to actually measure, as the system was rolled out, how the deforestation and the hunting of bushmeat stopped once the forest started providing an income without destroying it for the communities who live there. Now, it's not a perfect scheme, but it's one that's worked very well in that context. Then the third of my core values and virtues, and this is the value of localism. I don't know about you, but I've lived a pretty mobile life. I was born in India. By the time I was 20 years old, I'd had 15 different homes. My family had moved so many times. And for a long time, I didn't know where my home was, because I'd never lived long enough anywhere to think of it as home. We now live in a hyper-mobile world. And evidence shows that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be mobile and to move. And the more you move, the more likely you are to have a destructive relationship with the environment, because you don't feel at home. It's not your place anymore. It's not a place you care about, because you're removed from it. And that was my story. But for the last 25 years, I've lived in one very urban, multiracial corner of London, and it's become home. And the passage from the Bible that's spoken to me more and more has been this passage from Jeremiah 29. And it's words given to the people of Israel when they were exiles, carted off. They were refugees and asylum seekers in Babylon, the enemy city. They didn't want to be in Babylon. They wanted to be back home in Jerusalem and in Israel. But when they were in Babylon and they kept saying to God, how long must we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? We want to go. God said back to them, no, I want you to put down roots. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, invest in the future, marry and have sons and daughters, increase in number. It's not about population explosion. It's about having hope for the future. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. And prosperity in biblical terms is never purely financial. It includes that, but it's about well-being. Because if it prospers, you too will prosper. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And what we see there in these words from nearly 3,000 years ago is we see the pillars of sustainability. We see the ecological in green, the social in blue, the economic and political in red, And the fourth pillar that's often left out in secular analyses, the spiritual, praying for the city. It's about knowing and loving and caring for the place you are in. Whether or not you chose to be there, whether or not it's where you were born or where your family came from, but it's about getting to know our local place. And I think particularly for those of us who live in cities, this is a big and important challenge. Get to know your local place. Not just get to know the MTR map off in your head, not just get to know the best places to do your shopping, but also get to know the seasons, which in a city is difficult. Get to know the birds that migrate, even in a big city like Hong Kong. Get to know which trees are still here. Get to know the parks. Get to know the place. Because when we do that, we begin to live with more restraint, because we recognize our impact on the world around us. I showed earlier that map of planetary boundaries, or that diagram of planetary boundaries. This is something produced by the charity Oxfam on the basis of that planetary boundaries idea. But it's basically saying we have these boundaries around the outside, climate change, fresh water use, land use, etc., and we must not go over those lines. But in the middle here, we also have the people who at the moment do not even have education, income, water, food, health. And so we need to raise the poorest above that level whilst keeping the rest of us from going above the outer level. So we have this ring, this donut that we must live within, where everybody must have their basic needs met. But we must prevent ourselves from destroying our own future by caring for the planet we're in. And it's about moving from measuring just GDP, gross domestic product, to measuring human flourishing. There's only one country so far that has abandoned GDP as a measure of its success. It's the country of Bhutan, a small Buddhist kingdom in the Himalayas. And now they measure human flourishing as their national measure of success, rather than measuring GDP. And they take into account people's health, people's psychological well-being, biodiversity measures, land fertility, and many other factors as well. And then holism, the fourth of my virtues there. And some words here from a big conference that happened in Cape Town in 2010. The mission of God addresses individual persons, society and culture, and creation. Sometimes Christians have only focused on the first of those, as if our mission is only to convert individuals. But all three are broken and suffering: society and culture, the environment, creation, and individuals. All three are included in the redeeming love and mission of God, and all three must be part of the comprehensive mission of God's people. So it's a holistic and integrated view of the world, where faith, hope, and love apply to everybody, but also to the non-human creation. To put that in diagrammatic form, it's moving from a theology that is just about saving souls towards a theology that also includes human flourishing, because God cares passionately about the poor, and moving also to a theology that includes the flourishing of all creation, all made to God's glory. Those three dimensions are part of a holistic or integrated understanding of Christian faith. And it actually means that whatever your work, whatever your studies, whatever your business, it fits in. Because the whole of life is part of what God cares about. So whether you're an economist or a teacher, whether you work in a hospital, whether you're an accountant, whatever you happen to do, and I could list hundreds of different things, all of it fits within not just saving souls, but human flourishing and creation flourishing. The message of the whole of the Bible, and I've not mentioned my book so far, but I'll mention it here. This is an outline of some of the chapters of the book that's in both English and Chinese over there, planet-wise. The big story of the Bible, the big picture, goes through these big themes of creation, the fall, Israel, Jesus and the new creation. And Christians have often interpreted those only in very spiritual ways. But actually, all five of those major acts apply to the whole environment as well. Created good, spoilt by sin. Israel is the story of land and people. It's about how we are meant to live well in a place. Jesus, who came to save the world. All things in heaven and on earth redeemed through him. A new creation, which doesn't mean throwing away the old. The biblical understanding of new creation is about renewal, restoration, even you could say recycling. God's into recycling. He recycles broken people, he recycles a broken planet. So you can have a look at the book or ask me more on that if you want to. And I'm going to finish there with this verse which I mentioned early on. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. For those who take a faith-based worldview, we recognize that the whole of the environment, the whole of the cosmos, does not ultimately belong to governments or multinational corporations or rich individuals. All of it belongs to God. And we are part of those whom God has allowed to use and to enjoy creation as a gift. But we are also answerable to God and answerable to future generations and answerable to our fellow creatures for how we treat that planet that God has made so good. So now I've hopefully set lots of thoughts running in lots of directions, but I'm going to finish there. Hand back to Pat.
Yes, will you join me in giving a round of applause to Reverend Dave Bookless?